Hi, I'm Chris Mushler, VCDX 257 from virtualelephant.com. And recently I've been asked the question of what the documentation for a VCDX design should look like as you prepare for the application process. In this video, I'm going to share several examples of the table of contents and the structure of the documentation that you can leverage in your own application. Let's get started. Before we dive into the examples that I'm going to share with you today on what your VCDX design documentation could look like, let me first just preface this by saying that you as a candidate have an enormous amount of latitude. The most important thing to remember is that your documentation needs to cover all aspects of the VCDX blueprint for the track that you're applying for. How you accomplish this is really up to you. And these examples are meant to be just that, examples. Take from them what you feel helps you as a candidate best show your design mastery as you apply for the VCDX certification and write your documentation. Now, if you're at a PS organization, you might have a template that you use day in and day out. That can be a great starting point. Oftentimes, the blank page problem is the hardest thing to overcome as a candidate, and I hope that this video will shed some light on how you can solve the blank page problem to get started with your documentation. All right, let's dive into the three examples that I'm going to share with you today in this video. The first example is from the book IT Architect: Foundation in the Art of Infrastructure Design. Second, I'm going to share with you how the VMware validated designs used to look that VMware published up until just a few years ago. And then third, I'm going to share with you my own design documentation from what I submitted back in 2017 so that you can see how I took the information in the book, the information that I had just from the team that I was working on at the time, as well as what the earlier versions of the VMware Validated Design and the VMware Cloud Foundation platform were doing to form my own documentation structure. So let's dive right into the book. So I've spoken about the book in length before, and I will just say again that the book was one of the biggest factors in me passing the VCDX certification back in 2017. Now, the book was relatively new back then, and so while the examples might seem outdated today in 2023, the structure of the documentation that John and Chris and Mark shared in chapters 4 and chapter 6 can be a good example to you as a candidate today of how you should be structuring your documentation. Now, chapter 4 covers a server virtualization or a DCV design, while chapter 6 focuses on a Horizon desktop or VDI design. Now, you can see from both chapters that they have a common framework. And one of the things that both chapters make sure that they highlight is that you need to be covering the requirements, the constraints, the assumptions, and the risks within the documentation that you're creating, as well as also covering all of the aspects of the VCDX blueprint for the track that you're going on. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise to you as a candidate. We stress in the workshops that we give and in the articles and the videos that I've created how important the blueprint is. You need to make sure that your design documentation covers all aspects of the blueprint. And so you can see as they go through it, they start with the conceptual design. They show you what it's going to look like from a high level. They then focus on the logical design, getting a little bit closer into the details of what the architecture is going to look like before then focusing at the physical layer. Now, when we're talking about server virtualization, the physical layer more than likely means physical servers, physical switches, physical routers, the rack layout, how you're going to actually be connecting ports in the back of each physical server, what your cluster design is going to look like from a physical perspective, how many nodes are you going to have within a cluster. Now, these are all important aspects that you're going to want to make sure that you include in your design documentation, whether it's for server virtualization for an NSX or an NV network virtualization track, where you're going to have to cover things like what do your routers look like? How are you doing BGP, OSPF? What do your tier zeros? What do your tier ones look like? What are the uplinks going to be? These are all aspects of the design that you're going to want to make sure that you include. And looking through the book, you can see that there's a great amount of detail that they include, while at the same time, the examples in the book are rather light in other areas, and that's intended by design, because you as a candidate ought to be able to figure out all of the aspects that are unique to your design as well as alignment with the blueprint to make sure that your design documentation covers all aspects of the blueprint. All right, the second example that we're going to go over in the video today is the VMware Validated Design Documentation that VMware historically has published. Now, the most recent version of the VVD was published back in March of 2021 for version 6.2, but it's still applicable today as you as a candidate as a way to actually structure your documentation that you're creating for your own VCDX certification. Now, one of the things that I want to go over, and I'll link the PDF below in the description so you can go and download the PDF that I'm looking at. But really it covers 8 key areas, right? First, it kind of gives you an overview of what the documentation is going to cover. Again, this would be like your high-level executive summary or your business use case for the design that you're creating for the certification. And then second, it goes over from a high-level perspective or a conceptual design of what the SDDC architecture is going to look like. Now, from there, you're going to want to figure out how are you going to include your requirements, your constraints, your assumptions, your risks that you've identified within the design. You're going to want to include those tables where you've labeled those. Perhaps you've categorized them against the design categories like availability, reliability, security, performance, etc. And then they actually go into the actual design itself. And again, the VVD, just like the book, is going to show you how to cover it from a conceptual design perspective down to a logical design perspective into the actual physical design. Now, the thing that you'll find common between both the book and the VMware Validated Design Documentation, and what I would stress to you as a candidate to make sure that you include, is that you have good diagrams for everything that you're creating, okay? That you actually have detailed information within those diagrams. How are you going to be actually configuring each port on a switch? How are you going to be connecting every port in the back of the server up to the top of the rack switch? Okay, how are you going to be connecting your out-of-band network connectivity? These kinds of things, as well as all of the things that we've talked about in the past. The physical infrastructure layer, the virtual infrastructure layer, the security and compliance layer, okay? And then obviously if you are like doing the CMA, you're going to have some cloud management information there. Perhaps you're using vCloud Director or you're using ARIA Automation. You're going to want to include that information and that detailed information within the design documentation as well. Again, the VVD though, and keep this in mind if you're using it as a reference, is that it was not documentation written to meet every aspect of the VCDX. Now, I will tell you that several of the people who wrote the VVDs were all VCDX architects as well. And so you'll see a lot of common ground. And that's why this can be a good example for you as a candidate as you're figuring out how to structure all of your documentation and bring it together. Again, balancing it against the blueprint, figuring out what works for you and how you can leverage it so that it makes sense to you and to your chosen audience as you write your documentation. Now, one of the things that you're going to see from the VVD right away is that it lays out what that high-level design of the SDDC looks like. And one of the things that you'll have heard me talk about in the past, if you've attended one of the workshops or we've just had a casual conversation around architecture design, is that the VVD and the way that I prefer to design things is a building block, right? A repeatable structure that I can then take and apply, whether it's multiple availability zones, multiple data centers across the world, or just multiple units within a single data center or a single colo, right? You take these building blocks, and in the VMware Validated Design and the VMware Cloud Foundation, if you're familiar with its architecture, which closely matches the VVD, right, is that we have this concept of a management domain with X number of management clusters within it, as well as this concept of a workload domain with some number of clusters within it, or some number of workload domains within a single boundary or VCF domain or VMware Validated Design domain. Now, these are ways that you can then design everything to be repeatable. So regardless of what your requirements are, when somebody simply says, hey, I need more of this thing, you can say, well, here's what the building block looks like. Here's how it's been documented and all of the components that are going to be required on it. You go ahead and take that building block and you just put out however many of those that you actually need within your environment to achieve your business use case or achieve your requirements. And so that can help you when you think about things from a global perspective or a very large scale perspective of how do I actually capture that within a documentation? And that was one of the questions that I recently got. The example given to me by the candidate was, well, I'm designing multiple availability zones globally across many data centers. How do I capture that within my documentation? It's very difficult. Well, if you're designing these things as a building block, a Lego piece as you were, right? It's very easy to say, this is what the building block looks like. Now you just take how many of those building blocks you need for each availability zone, for each cluster, for each data center, whatever the case might be. And that is what my total global footprint looks like. And your VCDX certification and your design documentation that you're submitting for the certification can then explain to the panelists how that would work. So it makes things easier for you as an architect as you're working on your documentation to be able to show not just what you're doing for a single data center, but also how your architecture is capable of fulfilling a global need or a worldwide footprint need, to be able to show that you're thinking through all of the things. Okay, now you certainly might have variations within some of those individuals' locations, and your documentation that you submit can certainly cover those aspects that you're going to differ from one area to the next. Maybe you have GDPR compliance in EMEA that you're doing something slightly different with the logs because maybe you're only keeping the logs self-contained in an individualized region, or maybe you're doing something different in APAC because you have connectivity and bandwidth and latency challenges there that you don't have in EMEA or in the United States. So things like that you can document and highlight within your documentation to show the panelists that, hey, I've thought these things through and here's how I've solved these challenges. Now, the last example that I want to share with you is my own design documentation that I used back in 2017 when I earned my VCDX certification. Now, if you go to virtualelephant.com, you'll find that I have a whole section dedicated just to the VCDX certification. And one of the articles that I wrote and shared back, I think in 2017, was actually what my table of contents looked like for my design documentation. Now, you might be saying to yourself, why just the table of contents? Well, a couple of reasons. One, I personally invested an enormous amount of time in creating my own design documentation. And the idea of just putting it out there for anyone to just copy really didn't sit well with me. But I did want to make sure that I shared what my design documentation was actually structured like. And if you look at the table of contents, it actually will help you be able to solve the blank page problem that I talked about at the very beginning. Because the table of contents really shows you all of the key areas that I made sure to cover within my own documentation that align with the VCDX blueprint for the data center virtualization track that I applied and ultimately earned. Now, as we scroll through what I have within my table of contents, you can see that I start with an executive summary. Now, this is similar to what you saw within both the book and within the VMware Validated Design. And from there, I then move on to the requirements, the assumptions, the constraints, and the risks. Again, those are going to be one of the most critical aspects of your design documentation that you write and submit for the VCDX certification. The panelists, everything to do with the certification revolves around this section. Have you adequately captured all of the business requirements? Have you adequately captured all of the constraints that you're facing within the organization or the environment that you're designing for? Have you identified risks up front that you need to make sure that you mitigate within the design documentation and the architecture that you're creating as an architect as you're applying for the VCDX certification? And then again, right, inside of my own documentation, the next thing that I immediately go into after sharing and documenting the risks and everything is the conceptual design. I show you from a high-level perspective what the design is going to look like. And then I drill down into the logical layer. What does the logical design look like? And then I start talking about some of the architecture design decisions. Now, this is something that I talked about in the design decision video, which I'll share and link above for you to go back and reference as well. And I won't dive into in this video specifically, but documenting and having a table that works for you. Again, there's an example in the book of how you can do this. The VMware Validated Designs uses a very similar table for all of the design decisions that they've made. And I had my own from my own documentation, which I go over in that video. In each section of my documentation, I specifically highlight in a table what those design decisions that I made were, and I mapped them back. That decision maps back to this requirement, or it maps back to this constraint, or it was influenced by this risk that I had identified in the previous section. Now, I do that from a design documentation perspective to make it easy for the reader to be able to understand, oh, here's the 4 or 5 key design decisions that had to be made for this section. And for a panelist perspective, from the certification, it makes it very easy for me as a panelist to read through your design documentation and understand, like, oh, here are the key decisions that this architect has made. Okay, and then depending on what your design looks like, you may or may not need to do a workload capacity analysis. There's some information in my design documentation on how I did that. And then I go through compute, storage, the physical network, and then I dive into the virtual network design as well. And what you need to do is going to vary based off of what you've included in your own design documentation. And then the other part of the design documentation that we really haven't drilled down into is what supporting documentation do you need to make sure that you have? And so I had several appendices that I created in my own design documentation that I felt were relevant, that I felt helped me show mastery from a certification perspective for the panelists who were reviewing my design. And so one of the things that I did was I created an appendix of just all of the design decisions that I had made within that document. So whereas each section or chapter per se had a summary of the design decisions that were relevant to that section, in this Appendix A, I actually went through and just relisted. I basically just copy and pasted all of those tables and I just put them straight down to the bottom. Now this, I thought, helped accomplish 2 things. One, it made it easy for the panelists to go through and actually review every design decision that I'd made. So from a scoring perspective for me as a panelist, it makes it easy for me to say, oh, this candidate has covered all of the areas of the blueprint, because I can go through and just quickly browse all of the design decisions he or she has made. And then I can look at the scoring matrix and be like, oh, here's all the areas they covered. Here's maybe some of the areas where they missed, or maybe here's some questions that I'm going to have when we actually are at the design defense day and so forth to ask them questions. And then second, the other thing that it helped me as the candidate do by having all of these design decisions mapped in a single section was I actually went back through with pen and paper and I said, okay, I had requirements 1 through 10. This design decision, succeeded to capture, requirements 1, 2, 3, check, 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 4, 5, 6, check, check, check. And it helped me realize as I was going through it and judging myself against the blueprint before turning in my documentation that, oh, from a BCDR perspective, I was missing some stuff. And I knew that from a blueprint perspective, that meant that I needed to go back into the design documentation and cover some areas in the blueprint that I hadn't actually covered for the work project that I was working on. But it helped me make sure that, hey, for every requirement that I documented at the bottom, I had at least one design decision that checked that requirement off. Yes, I actually met that design decision requirement, or that design decision had met that requirement, and I had checked it off. And so that I knew that, oh, boom, boom, boom. And so that way for you as a candidate, you might realize like, oh, I had this requirement for X, and I actually I don't have a design decision around that. How am I going to meet that? What have I missed? What do I need to go back and do and document within my documentation? So again, this is my personal opinion. Obviously, it's a video of my personal opinions. But for you as a candidate, I think that this can be something that you should consider within your own design documentation to make sure that you've really kind of filled out everything, that you haven't missed any, you don't have any massive gaps within your design documentation that you're turning in. And then I did some other things around like the management VM summaries, like what were those specs going to be? I had some information around what SLA definitions were, how I was actually going to be meeting those things. And then I covered some other stuff like affinity and anti-affinity rules for some of the core components within both the management domain and the workload domains that I thought were specific, as well as having things like an end-to-end VM network diagram. So how from a virtual machine all the way out to the physical layer it was going to look, as well as the software versions of the software bomb that I was using, as well as any references. And I think that's important too. We don't really talk about that very much, but if there's things that you leveraged official documentation, blog articles, whatever it might have been, make sure that you have those references and that you've cited them appropriately so that we don't think that you're just copying and, claiming somebody else's work for your own. Now, from a practical perspective, okay, some of the other things that I would recommend that you do as a candidate for your design documentation is have a list of all of the figures that you've created. Have a list of all of the diagrams that you have within your documentation. Make sure the hyperlinks work. So make sure that all of those links work so that as you're going back and reviewing, one, it makes it easy for you to review and skip back and forth. And secondly, it makes it easier for the panelists to skip back and forth as well. Now, again, you have a lot of latitude of how you're going to actually accomplish all of these things within your design documentation. But I did want to share with you how I've done it. I hope that this helps you as a candidate prepare for the VCDX certification. Again, I recommend that you go out, grab that book if you haven't already, The IT Architect, Foundation in the Art of Infrastructure Design. It's linked below in the description. Okay, I have no affiliation other than I just know the authors and they're great people and they love the VCDX community. And the reason that they wrote the book is to be able to help the community grow. The reason that I create these videos is to help the next generation of VCDX candidates be able to be successful as they go through this certification process. So leverage the book as much as you can. Use it as a reference. Again, the VMware Validated Designs, another great reference for you to be able to look, how can I potentially structure my documentation? How can I solve the blank page problem? And then figure out what works best for you, right? Make sure that the documentation, once again, covers everything within the blueprint. Okay, make sure that you've documented what is unique about your design. What was the interesting business problem that you perhaps solved? What makes this design meet all of those requirements, and capture all of that in the written word in your design documentation. I hope you found this video useful as a VCDX candidate, as an aspiring cloud architect, or just as someone who's looking to improve their skill set in the architecture space. Please leave comments below or reach out to Twitter to me and let me know what you thought of the video. And if you like this content and want to see more of it, make sure that you subscribe to my channel on YouTube. I have a whole playlist dedicated just to the VCDX certification, covering many aspects of things that can help you as an individual become a better architect. I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Until next time, thanks.